All right, I'm now here with Gary Gerstle. He is the Paul Mellon Professor of American History at the University of Cambridge and the author of many books, including, of course, his most recent, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order. Gary, great to see you. Good to have you back.
It's good to be back, Jen. Thanks.
I actually want to pick up on our discussion from last time. You, of course, were on our channel to talk about the rise and fall of the neoliberal order, and I think something that I think is interesting to discuss is the New Deal order, because you point out that the US has actually experienced two major political orders. There's, of course, the neoliberal order, which we discussed last time, and the New Deal order that comes before it, which you talk about quite a bit in your book on the neoliberal order. The New Deal order, of course, lasted for around half a century in the US between the 1930s and 1980s. Maybe just to open, how would you characterize the New Deal order?
Well, it emerged in the Great Depression, and it was presided over by Franklin Roosevelt. It didn't begin as a political order, began as a political movement. And at its core was an ideological principle oppositional to what became central to the neoliberal order. The core ideological principle was that capitalism left to its own devices was chaotic, destructive, harmful to people, harmful to capitalists, harmful to elites, and that it couldn't function if left to its own devices, if the ideology of laissez-faire, then very popular, or before the New Deal order came in, was allowed to prevail. And in order for capitalism to work, in order for American democracy to survive, the federal government had to take upon itself the responsibility for managing capitalism in the public interest. I don't know if I'd call this anti-capitalist. I don't think I would see in Roosevelt an effort to supersede capitalism. But the belief, and it was central to the time and went to all parts of the body politic, was that capitalists needed help. And the federal government took it upon itself to provide stability, to help with the business cycle, and crucially, to make concessions to groups in American society that in a free market capitalist system would have very little power or influence. I'm thinking mostly of workers, the labor movement. It required a set of compromises between elites and those on the poor end of the political spectrum to bring more security, to bring more equality, to bring more justice into American life. And one can see the biggest concession or compromise having to do with the labor movement, which prior and even in the first couple of years of the Great Depression was extremely weak and almost a non-factor in American society, except among very skilled elements of the labor force, where they could enforce their skills or withdraw their labor power, and employers had to contend with them. But generally, for most workers, it was very weak and very inconsequential. And it became, during the 1930s and 40s, one of the most powerful elements in American life. And employers felt compelled, for a variety of reasons, to compromise with workers and their labor unions. And this caused a significant redistribution of power in American society away from elites down to the lower orders. It's also the moment when a federal welfare state established itself for the first time. And beyond the interests of workers, there was a sense that the federal government had an obligation to look out for the welfare of all Americans. And that meant not just strengthening unions on the shop floor and giving them more rights, but it meant a deep commitment to public regulation in something that was described as the public interest. And that meant the imposition of federal regulation on Wall Street. It meant the imposition of federal regulation on America's new mass communications industry, then radio, and a little bit later, television. And in so many areas of American life, there was a commitment to the public over the private, not to eliminate the private, but to have a robust sense of the common weal and the public good. And central to the New Deal order was this conviction that society would not operate well unless this commitment to the public good was broadly shared and deeply rooted in American life. This characterizes the New Deal order from the moment it becomes an order, which I think doesn't happen right away. It happens in the late 40s and early 1950s. And it continues to characterize American life until the New Deal order begins to break up in the 1970s. So that gives you a sense of what the New Deal order wanted to be.
Mm-hmm. So something that you have previously discussed is that part of what defines a political order, as opposed to just a political movement or political ideology, is the ability of the dominant party to kind of compel the opposition party to adopt its terms, right? So, the last time you were on, we talked about what that looked like under neoliberalism. I think the kind of quintessential example is Bill Clinton and the Democrats in the 90s, pushing through deregulation of the financial sector, communications, welfare reform, and sort of adopting the principles of neoliberalism, even though the Democrats are, ostensibly the opposition party, right? So what does the sort of capitulation of the opposition party look like during the New Deal order?
Well, for a while, the opposition party was very, very weak, this being the Republican Party. Roosevelt won re-election 3 times, 1936, 1940, and 1944. He was so successful at winning re-election that an amendment was passed after that time, limiting a president to 2 terms to make sure no one would have that kind of longevity again. And the question, at some point, the Republicans were going to come back into power. And the question is, what would they do when they did? And in 1946, 47, 1948, after World War II, the key figure in the Republican Party is Robert Taft, senator from Ohio. He was called Mr. Republican because he was thought to embody the quintessence of republicanism at that time. And this man abhorred the large federal state. He thought it was un-American. He thought it was threatening to American liberty. He wanted to take that state down. He wanted to roll America back to what it was in the 1920s and the 19-teens. He saw the New Deal as putting America on the road to collectivism, which he meant socialism, communism, some form of totalitarianism. And this was the man who was expected to become, in the 1946, 47, 48, the next president of the United States, because he was thought to embody the true Republican values. Mm-hmm. And as senator, he is successful in 1946, 47, in terms of rolling back some New Deal efforts. He weakens labor law through the so-called Taft-Hartley Act, of which he was the sponsor in the Senate. He's talking about rolling back taxation rates on the wealthy. He's reluctant to get involved in the Cold War because he thinks that's going to lead America to having a large, centralized, militaristic state, which he doesn't want. And he is the man who is expected to take down the New Deal and restore America to earlier and more virtuous times. And yet the man who becomes president, the first Republican president, doesn't happen in 48, it happens in 1952, is Dwight D. Eisenhower. And for a long time, people didn't know whether Dwight D. Eisenhower was a Republican or a Democrat. And he succeeds in pushing Taft to the side and becoming the nominee of the party and then winning election in 1952. And the question is, what is he going to do when he comes into office? This is the crucial moment when the New Deal moves from movement to political order. I see Eisenhower's central role as leading the Republican Party into acquiescence to the New Deal. He does not try and roll back labor's power. Mm-hmm. He does not try to dissemble Social Security or other elements of the welfare state. In fact, he increases the beneficiaries of Social Security, and perhaps most astounding of all, he takes it upon himself to rethink the tax code, which has gone through numerous changes in the 1940s, 1930s, and 1940s. The tax rate on the highest income group in America, set in World War II, which continues after the war, is somewhere between 91 and 94%. Let me repeat that, between 91 and 94%. This has to be the most un-Republican policy that one could imagine. And the expectation was that when a Republican came into office, he would roll back that tax rate very, very substantially. The tax rate had made the central government revenue rich. It had made it much more powerful than the states themselves. It had centralized power to an unprecedented degree in Washington. And the expectation was if Taft would have had his way, he would have rolled back that tax rate to much lower levels. And Eisenhower tinkers with it around the edges. He makes some concessions to the wealthy to help them a little bit. But that marginal tax rate remains intact. And if a Republican were to propose that today in the Republican Party, they would have one more day left in the Republican Party. They would be banished from it and called not just a Democrat, they'd probably be called a socialist. Mm-hmm. And the fact that he could accept labor's power, the welfare state, high taxation rates, he also committed himself to broad public works project manifesting itself in the Interstate Highway project, which was the grid built during his presidency. The fact that he assents to all this is a sign to me that the New Deal was now compelling not just Democrats to play on its turf, but Republicans as well. So the New Deal movement becomes a New Deal political order in the early 50s. This is the moment when the Republicans under Eisenhower get on board. And it's not clear what Eisenhower felt in his heart.
Right.
He does write a private letter to his brother in which he says any Republican who thinks about getting rid of Social Security, labor's power, high taxation rate, they will have no future in politics. And for me, I didn't need to hear anything else. No future in politics. This is a sign of submission, acquiescence, someone who wants to be a relevant political player, just as Clinton wanted to be a relevant political player in the 1990s. The question becomes, what do you have to do to remain a relevant political player? And what you have to do is to accept the core principles of what is perceived to be the dominant political order in American life. And this is what Eisenhower pulls off. It doesn't mean there aren't dissenters. It doesn't mean that Taft dies in the early 50s. It doesn't mean there are no dissenters as radical or even more radical than he was. This is the moment when William F. Buckley is launching the National Review and trying to reassert a truer conservatism in American life. There are other people very unhappy with Eisenhower and the Republican Party, including a man by the name of Ronald Reagan. But they have no traction. They have no political traction in the 1950s. They have no political influence. They might be eloquent to their supporters, but they are utterly marginal in American life. And this, to me, is a sign that a powerful political order is at work ordering the political landscape and determining what it is possible to talk about in politics.
So you had alluded to the Cold War, and the Soviet Union is an important part of this story in your account. So I want to ask you about that because, I think that there is an idea, especially on the left, and I'm sympathetic to this idea that, anti-communism in the 1940s and 50s, the Red Scare and so forth, obviously fractured the labor movement and in a way, undermined key aspects of the New Deal or sort of kept the New Deal from becoming more radical or more transformative than it could have been. Now, you actually argue that the threat of communism helped stabilize the New Deal order. So maybe talk a little bit about that. How did the presence of the Soviet Union kind of shape the New Deal order? And specifically, how did it play into what you were just talking about, the Republican acquiescence to the New Deal order?
Well, the argument that you referred to that you're sympathetic to, I am actually sympathetic to as well, or was. And if you go back to not just my earliest writing as a scholar, but writing for a decade or two, you will find precisely that argument made, that the welfare state, the labor movement, popular democracy were all kept from achieving their potential by using scaremongering about communism coming to America. And that inclined Democrats and perhaps even progressives to moderate their demands and do things so they wouldn't be seen as being soft on communism. This is a very popular argument and view. It's true in the academy. It's true beyond the academy among a lot of people who think about this very seriously. So I take this idea myself very seriously. And I think there are instances where it's obviously true, where progressive elements of the labor movement, of other organizations in American life, of left political organizations, of civil rights organizations, they were red-baited, they were either compelled to purge themselves or voluntarily took on a purging so as to make their organizations more suitable for the vital center, we might say, of American life. But as I was writing this book, I began to notice another pattern and to ask other questions. And I began to ask, well, why is what I would call the apogee of the welfare state, why does that coincide with the height of the Cold War? Why does the strongest the American labor movement has ever been, why does that occur when the Cold War is at its most intense in the 1950s and 60s? Why are those decades the decades in which income and wealth inequality are less than any other period of American life? This is economists like Paul Krugman and others have called this the Great Compression, where the distance between the rich and the poor shrinks very, very significantly, so that by 1960, the average CEO of an American corporation is making 20 times what an average factory worker is making. By 2000, they are making 300 times what the average factory worker is making. And if you go back to the early 20th century, you find similar ratios as well. So why is this moment of relative equality, why has it happened in 1960 or 1955 or 1965? And so as I began to think about this, I began to see communism and the Soviet Union in somewhat different terms. And I began to think that actually communism was a force that enabled the labor movement to become stronger, the welfare state to become more accepted, high tax rates to be seen as legitimate, because communism was seen as both a global and domestic threat. And there was a theory at the time that communism was totalitarian. I think that theory was subsequently proven to be wrong, or at least in one important respect, wrong. What scared people about totalitarianism, a theory developed by Hannah Arendt and others, was that totalitarian regimes, and this included collectivisms of the right as well as the left, communism and fascism and Nazism, this was seen as being a new kind of dictatorship that the world had never seen before. And because the leaders of these regimes had found ways using new technologies to mobilize the masses and embed them in all kinds of propaganda, to either be on a war footing constantly or to threaten people with being on a war footing constantly, that ordinary people could not resist the power of these propaganda agencies and the power that these regimes had. And so thus the theory went, and here I want to distinguish between the theory and reality, but the theory went, and the theory was believed. The theory was that if a totalitarian regime was established, you would never get rid of it. If a communist state was established, you could never get rid of it. It would be there forever. People would never find a way out, even if they wanted to. Their demands would be crushed under an unbelievable power of autocracy. And because this theory was believed, and this helps us understand why the United States got itself so deeply invested in Vietnam, which did not have a market for the United States that it was interested in the 1950s, did not have natural resources. It was the domino effect that if Vietnam fell, it would be permanently communist. And then it would expand to Thailand, and then it would expand to Laos, and then it would expand to Cambodia, and then it would expand to Indonesia, and then it would expand to the Philippines. And God forbid it then expanded to Japan. Of course, it had already expanded to China. What made the domino theory so fearful to people was that the sense not just that countries would fall to communism, but once they fell, they could never be freed. Mm-hmm. And so more and more of the world would be encased in, from the West's perspective, the capitalist West perspective, would be ensnared in a kind of slave realm from which people could never be freed. And so one had to fight this wherever it reared its head, and one had to fight it with a great deal of vigor. Domestically, I think that capitalist elites were willing to compromise with labor when communism was strong, because they feared that if they did not compromise with non-communist elements of the labor movement, that the labor movement might become communist at some point. Communists had a strong presence in the labor movement. They were among the most important organizers of labor unions in the 1930s and 40s. In the late 40s, before the Taft-Hartley Act, communists were presidents in about 7 or 8 unions comprising more than 1 million members. So the idea that communism could not come to America, this was not an idea believed by many political leaders and many elite members of the capitalist community. And the fear that communism might take over their unions, their enterprises, their country, inclined them to compromise in ways that they otherwise might not have been willing to compromise. They were doing something they didn't really want to do. It's not like they wanted strong unions at their workplaces, but they felt that the compromise with non-communist labor unions was worth it because it would establish a model of industrial relations that would be resolutely anti-communist, and over the long term, that would benefit capitalism. So capitalists had an incentive to compromise with elements of the labor movement that they otherwise would not have had. The big compromise that comes to symbolize the New Deal order is the so-called Treaty of Detroit between the United Auto Workers and the big 3 automobile manufacturers in Detroit. And this became a model for labor relations. The leader of the UAW, Walter Reuther, had been very interested in communism in his youth. In fact, had spent a couple years with his brother Victor in a Soviet automobile plant in the early to mid-30s and regarded it as, at the time, the epitome of a proletarian democracy. He then becomes disillusioned with communism. He fights to purge communists from his union. So it's not that he was friendly to communists, but he also, I think, understood that the communist threat could be used to compel capitalists to enter into concessions to the labor movement that they might not otherwise be willing to countenance. Mm-hmm. And I think ultimately this affects not just capitalist elites. I think it affects the Republican Party and helps us understand why Eisenhower got the nod over Robert Taft. Taft was very slow to rise to the challenge of the Cold War. He was not eager for worldwide commitment of America to fighting in all these places. He did not want a big military. Eisenhower was just the opposite. He said communism is the biggest threat we face internationally and domestically, and we must be vigilant. We must have a large state. We must acquiesce to certain working class demands. We must prove that America can deliver a better life to Americans than the Soviet Union can to its own citizens. And so a welfare state's important, good wages are important, orderly and productive relations between capital and labor are important. All these things that the Republican Party otherwise would have objected to become palatable to them. It's not like this is their first choice, but they feel they have to make these concessions so as to ensure that America will continue to be free. Mm-hmm. So this is the way in which the fear of communism influences elites and other segments of American society to make compromises with labor, to accept a robust welfare state, to tax individual Americans to unheard of levels. This is worth it for the greater cause of preserving America as a capitalist country. But that preservation, because there was this ardent opponent of capitalism out there, this capitalism required very serious compromises with elements of the working class and the poor in American society.
So given kind of this like geopolitical balance of forces, I suppose that now raises the question of when and why did the New Deal order collapse, right? Or when did it start to unravel? Because, the Soviet Union obviously won't collapse until the 1990s. And in the 1970s, there's another economic crash in the US. So why was the kind of specter of the Soviet Union not effective by that point?
Well, the New Deal order has fracture points and tension points. All political orders do. The United States is a huge country. These political parties have to corral very different constituencies for the sake of continuing to be elected. And so there are always tension points. And there are three developments that occur in the 60s and 70s that begin to unravel the New Deal order. The first is race. In order for Roosevelt to succeed with his progressive legislation in the 1930s, he needs the support of the white South. The white South is segregationist. It's reigned by terror. Blacks have no political voice. There's really only one effective political party, the Democrats. And because there's only one effective political party, congressmen and senators serving from the South tend to serve very long periods of time because there's no effective opposition, which means they have seniority, which means they control critical committees. And these southern barons of Congress are very powerful in the 1930s, and they tell Roosevelt that we will go along with your progressive economic legislation as long as you don't interfere with the racial and class hierarchies of the South, and as long as you don't touch Jim Crow, which is really another name for American apartheid. And Roosevelt feels he has no alternative but to go along with that. But the New Deal is also mobilizing blacks and also setting in motion a mass migration of African Americans from the South to the North, where they become more politically effective and have opportunity to vote. And so the civil rights issue can only be put off for so long, and it comes to a head in the 1960s. When Democratic politicians are faced with embracing a campaign for racial equality and putting one of the worst elements, perhaps the worst element of American life behind them, or continuing to accede to the white Democrats of the South's demands. And in the 60s, the Democratic Party moves decisively away from segregation, embraces the civil rights movement. And this causes what had been a very important electoral constituency of the Democratic Party to begin its own long march from the Democrat to the Republican Party. So the Democrats are embroiled in that. The Vietnam War sounds like a good idea, but it becomes a disastrous foreign policy venture. And so this becomes another important point of tension. And then the global political economy begins to change in profound ways that don't immediately affect the Soviet Union or the communist nations and bloc. The U.S. had no serious rivals in the 1940s and 50s, and it does in the form of Japan and Germany by the late 60s and early 70s. And also there's a profound restructuring of relations between the global North and the global South. The economic miracle after World War II depended on the cheap flow of energy. The cheap flow of energy depended on Anglo-American companies controlling how much oil was going to be extracted from Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries and the prices that were going to be charged. And the early 70s is marked by the rise of OPEC and the declaration on the part of these commodity producing nations that these resources belong to us and not to you, global North countries. And so there's a radical reordering of the terms under which petroleum and other commodities will be produced and the price at which they will be sold to the global North. And so on top of the social divisions that emerge in the 1960s, comes this economic shock, this oil shock, and suddenly the global North, accustomed to the unending cheap supply and flow of petroleum, is faced with extremely rising prices. And a recession happens that the New Deal policymakers with their Keynesian toolkit can't solve. So this is what opens the door to alternative ideas. This is what brings the neoliberals from the margins closer to the mainstream. This is what brings them from irrelevance to relevance, and they find their man in Ronald Reagan. So this is also the decade in which the Soviet Union is beginning to ail economically. From the 1930s to the 1950s, one could have serious arguments about who was doing a better job of providing for its people, the Soviet Union or the capitalist West. By the late 60s and early 70s, the Soviet Union is falling behind. Its economic ailing, its disregard of markets, its attempts to run everything from the center through nationally engineered 5-year plans is not working. New technologies are beginning to appear that are going to come to be associated with the IT revolution, and these require a kind of free flow of information in a society of the sort that the Soviet Union is not willing to allow. So it begins to slide in the 70s and 80s. And I would say Reagan sort of baits them into a deeper slide through his so-called Star Wars campaign, where he undertakes to move away from what was called the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the Soviet Union and Russia not attacking each other because everything would be destroyed. Reagan believes that he can create a dome over America that's going to stop all incoming nuclear weapons and thus eliminate the threat of the Soviet Union, which would allow America to go on the offensive against the Soviet Union in ways that it had not before. I remember this. Reagan was laughed at the time by many Americans in the sense that this is never going to work. And of course, missiles that were sent up were always misfiring, and clearly nuclear weapons were going to get through. But the people who took this threat very seriously were the Soviets themselves, who felt that America had a decided technological advantage. And if this was allowed to go on, that the United States would, over the long term, gain a decisive advantage over the Soviet Union. And this becomes one of the factors plunging the Soviet Union into a deeper and more prolonged crisis, and opens the door to a reformer like Gorbachev, who tries to introduce more marketization, more political freedom into Soviet society. He is going to fail, and when he fails, this is a very complicated situation, but let me just say now that he may have been one of the last believers in the possibility of Soviet socialism. That's what allowed him to embark on his campaign of very serious reform. But at the end of the day, he comes to believe that if socialism can't be saved, if it can't be truly socialistic, then the Soviet Union is not worth saving. And he, in a sense, allows the Soviet Union to fall apart and to slip into history, which may be almost unprecedented in the annals of empire. Mm-hmm. And this leads to the extinction of the Soviet Union by 1991. So the neoliberalism is not yet in order. Reagan gets elected. He's putting neoliberal principles into action. But I argue in the book that neoliberalism doesn't really become a political order until after the Soviet Union's fall in 1991, and the elimination of capitalism's most ardent enemy from the face of the planet, the ability of capital to go global in a way that had not been able to go global since prior to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and arguably since prior to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, this moment in the 1990s is the first time that capitalism becomes completely global in a way it had not been for 75 years. And it also forces the left to reckon with the spectacular nature of the Soviet failure. This, the most ambitious effort to construct an economy on radically different principles from capitalist principles. No one expected the Soviet Union to enter the dustbin of history as quickly and as decisively as it did in 1991. And this causes, I think, a crisis of faith among leftists of all sorts. Even though many had already decided that the Soviet Union was not a model they wanted to follow for their own countries. Nevertheless, to see even the capacity for reform eliminated, any kind of future for socialism in the Soviet Union, the complete abandonment of that, I think causes a crisis of faith among the left everywhere in the world. And this creates further opportunity for neoliberal ideas to triumph. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, a series of factors in the 60s and 70s allowing neoliberalism to gather steam, to elect a president, to put in place policies for that president to put pressure on the Soviet Union that, in a sense, is going to intensify its decline and then its abolition. And that's the enabling condition for neoliberalism moving from movement to political order in the 1990s.
So I think to wrap up, I want to sort of fast forward to the erosion or the downfall of neoliberalism, which we talked about in greater detail in our last talk. But I think in a way, the end of neoliberalism or the erosion of neoliberalism kind of brings us back to the New Deal, right? Because as you pointed out, one of the kind of hallmarks of the crumbling legitimacy of neoliberalism is the rise of a politician like Bernie Sanders. And so much of his platform, I think, very explicitly harkens back to kind of a New Deal style framework of the public good. He is a proponent of the Green New Deal, which is, very explicitly a kind of an attempt to revive some of the public works programs of the New Deal under a kind of climate framework, right? So I suppose the question is, without this specter of communism, do you see possibilities for another sort of New Deal style compromise between capital and labor as we're in the waning days of neoliberalism?
Well, that's the $1,000,000 question.
Right.
I feel I should turn it back to you, since this is going to be your generation's challenge to figure out. And this, in some ways, is Jacobin's challenge, right? In terms of the kind of discussions that are going on in the pages of the journal and discussions you're having with each other and your readers and those people who you are engaged with. And to the appearance of Sanders, his significance, and he was both a product of and accelerated the revival of the left, which I date to Occupy Wall Street, which other people might date to the WTO protests in Seattle in 1999. We can debate that at another time. But the left is reviving in some way in the first decade of the 21st century, and I see Occupy Wall Street as a critical moment that enables Sanders, it enables Warren, it enables the other progressives and radicals who now sit in Congress and also who are involved in all these various left movements in political life that didn't exist in 10 or 15 years ago. So and Bernie Sanders' success in 2016 and 2020, forcing his opponents both in the Democratic and Republican parties to take him into account, has been a tremendous accelerating force in the revival of this left. So it is now a force to be reckoned with in American life that it has not been, I would argue, since the 1930s and 40s, which makes the New Deal moment that much more relevant. The question is, can it succeed without the hammer supplied by the communist movement? I don't mean that necessarily directly, but the fear of communism and the conviction that many elites in American society, many capitalists, felt that there was an imperative of compromise so as to avert the worst, and a willingness to consider a reformed capitalism, a capitalism more oriented to the public interest, for the sake of preserving capitalist institutions, even if the revenue stream and the profit stream would not be quite as high as it otherwise would be, to accept a moderation in the division between those who are poor and those who are extraordinarily wealthy. And, we're seeing the revival of labor movements in a whole variety of places in the United States now, which is reminiscent from some of those early revivals in the 1930s, 1933, 34, 35, very uncertain, no central direction, but a sense that labor has to be on the march for America to move in a progressive direction. The question is, what will compel elites in American society to compromise with that movement? And now part of the answer to that is numbers, power, the ability to disrupt production if some kind of accommodation is not reached, if no one in America can get a cup of coffee because all the Starbucks workers are on strike. That's got to create some turmoil in American society. But what's going to compel the head of Starbucks to do what he's currently refusing to do, or what Jeff Bezos doesn't want to do, which is to enter into a compromise with the forces of organized labor. Now, if the forces of organized labor continue to grow in strength and in numbers and political influence, they will feel that pressure. But I find myself asking, and I don't have a ready answer for you to this question, of if an extra force is needed beyond the give and take of American politics, what will that force be? Right. It's possible that climate politics will offer that kind of force in the sense of it's just becoming harder and harder for almost anyone to ignore the damage being done to the planet. And it may be that that acts as a compulsory force. It may be that there will be a militant form of socialism that emerges that tries to extract what was positive about communism from what I would say can't be repeated, a kind of tyranny of control from the center. There may be a new kind of political formation that arises that recoups some of communism's power without carrying with it the kind of damage that I would say communism did to those groups who aspire to having democracy. But if I put the question back to you, where do you look, in the discussions that you're having?
Right. Well,
because this is a key question for our time.
Yeah.
This is a key question.
Yeah. Well, the reason why the question of the Soviet Union and the way that it operated during the 1940s or during the 30s and 40s was why I'm so interested in your answer to that is because I don't see something like that existing right now, right? Like a kind of geopolitical specter that can, as you say, sort of help shape the opposition, the acquiescence of the opposition. But I mean, what you said about the power of the labor movement and its ability to alter or shut down production in strategic sectors, that's all we talk about on this show and in Jacobin. So that's where we're looking as well. It's an open question to be continued, I suppose.
Well, I would put it to you and your listeners to, and if they're those who listen to this podcast in their comments to hold forth on this. And
I'm interested as well, so please weigh in.
Because I think you framed it exactly right. And sometimes half the battle is framing the right question. Because if you frame the right question, at least you can focus your mind on the direction in which an answer has to go. And I do believe very strongly that the Great Compromise of the 1940s and early 50s was a reflection of, as you phrased it, these geopolitical pressures that the United States was feeling as a nation, that elites in American society were feeling, a real worry on their part that if they did not compromise, the system that they value might not survive another 10 or 15 years. And I think, I hope that this discussion that we're having will generate some interesting ideas about how to think about this. And it's something that it's very important to discuss if a new progressive political order is to triumph.
All right, Gary Gerstle, again, is the author of the recent book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order. We will link our other interview with him down below. Gary, great to see you. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.